What is up, everybody? How's everybody doing?
Hello, everyone.
What's up? What's up? Our first, babe, are you excited? Our first mental health professional woman who rocks.
Absolutely. She is, as I was telling her before, she's our first one, and she is setting the bar extremely high. We are so excited to have Dr. Joni Johnston tonight.
And check out this thing with the brain. I don't know what it is. I just figured out how to do this, but I figured it would be cool to have this thing. So let me set up who Dr. Joni Johnston is because talk about a woman who rocks. It took me about like 20 minutes just to write up this bio that we have here because she is amazing. Dr. Johnson is a forensic psychologist, private investigator, and a crime writer. As a practicing psychologist, she has worked in a medium maximum security prison for the Board of Parole, for the Superior Court of San Diego, and as a workplace investigator of misconduct allegations, including harassment, discrimination, and violence. She currently evaluates mentally disordered offenders up for parole and provides expert testimony in criminal and civil litigation, where a forensic psychologist can shed light on pertinent issues. She is also an author, folks, and she has authored the books Serial Killers, 101 Questions True Crime Fans Ask, Psychology, The Idiot's Guide for Psychology, the fifth edition, The Complete Idiot's Guide, which is good. I need all these books because I'm a complete idiot. The Complete Idiot's Guide to Controlling Anxiety, The Complete Idiot's Guide to Overcoming Anxiety, Fight Your Fright, a holistic approach to understanding and overcoming anxiety, and Appearance Obsession, learning to love the way you look. I should probably take out that one. But in addition to that, she also has a YouTube channel called Unmasking a Murderer. And if you folks, mods, if you put the exclamation point Joni, you put the command in there, and all her websites should come up, as well as her newsletter. Her YouTube channel, Unmasking a Murderer, explores the who, what, when, where, and how, but most especially the why of criminal behavior. From serial killers to child animal abusers, Dr. Johnson takes a look at the psychology behind crime. What did I tell you, folks? A woman who rocks. Without further ado, Dr. Joni Johnston. How are you doing, Dr. Johnston?
I'm great. I'm really honored to be on your show tonight.
Thank you so much for being here. And I will start with Babe. Go ahead.
I always love to ask this question very first thing. I want to know what you were like when you were a girl. What were you like growing up, Dr. Johnston?
Well, I was pretty much a tomboy for sure. I liked to play baseball with my dad. My dad was a professional baseball player for a while when I was a kid. So I thought he was like, I don't know, Mickey Mantle or Babe Ruth, which he was not. But of course, when you're 4, 5, or 6, he is. And so I kind of idolized him. And I had a brother. So we used to play together a lot. So my mom was really despairing of ever having a girly girl. Then my sister came along, and luckily for me, she kind of fixed that for my mom. So I was pretty adventurous, I would say. Also, I have to say, once I became a psychologist, I then realized how lucky I was as a kid as well. Because just talking to people, both victims as well as perpetrators, and seeing some of the backgrounds and childhoods that they experienced, I think we all, we think of our families as normal, and that comes with good things, bad things, etc. And so that's normal for us. And so I don't know that I completely appreciated how great my childhood was until I began working with people who did not have the same experience.
Well, I'm curious. So, professional, we're both huge baseball fans, me and Shannon. So, professional, what position, what team was he on?
He was a pitcher, and he played for the Chicago White Sox.
Very cool. All right, that's awesome. All right. So, my question would be, what made you want to become a forensic psychologist, and could you just explain to the folks what exactly that is?
Yeah, so a forensic psychologist is basically where law and psychology meet. So, any situation or any question where a psychologist might be able to shed light on some legal matter, it's really broad. we oftentimes think about these insanity pleas that somebody comes on and they, allegedly committed a horrible crime, and they're saying that I was, mentally ill, I was insane at the time, and so somebody comes and evaluates them. I do quite a few of those, but it really is much broader than that. So, for example, in a divorce situation, you might have a custody battle, and you might have a forensic psychologist who's evaluating parenting ability, or you might have somebody who's involved in a car accident and they're claiming emotional distress because of this car accident. You might have a sexual assault victim who's claiming certain things, or you might evaluate risk. So it's really any situation or any legal situation where a psychologist can help answer that legal question. That's what I try to do.
Wow. And what made you want to go into that field? Like, what would was there something specific that, or you just, what was the decision to follow that?
I'm starting to think it might have a genetic component just because my mom was like a true crime, like just fanatic. I mean, she watched every detective show on TV at the time. This was, of course, years ago. I remember one time we were on this family vacation. We had to go by this house, like on our trip. We had to go by this famous house where a family had been murdered. So it's kind of like, you know, yeah. So I remember specifically, though, on this long vacation at age 14, which, when you're 14, as you might remember, the thrill of being stuck in the car with your family for 2 weeks every day. I mean, I was desperate for reading material. And so my mother had just read Helter Skelter, the Charles Manson, family murders. And so I read that, which we could discuss the appropriateness of that at another time. But I was absolutely just horrified by it, confused by it, mad about it, fascinated by it. I mean, all of the above. I just absolutely could not understand why somebody would want to hurt somebody they didn't even know. I just did not compute. And so that really started, I think, my interest. It kind of changed me from a budding true crime person aficionado to somebody who wanted to do it as a career. And then when I was a senior in high school, Ted Bundy escaped from a jail in Colorado, made his way down to the Cuyahoga sorority house at FSU, which was about 80 miles from my house, and wreaked havoc down there. And just seeing the aftermath of that, which 80 miles is pretty far away, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I mean, it was just horrendous. And I think that really solidified my decision that there's got to be some way to figure out and prevent, ideally, um, these horrific things from happening.
Wow. Well, we just took our 14-year-old and two 12-year-olds on just a 3-day vacation. So I'm just curious when they tell their story about us and how terrible, they're probably gonna tell us. I wonder what they're gonna go into after our. What do you think, babe? What are they gonna go into after our vacation?
Well, we did make them eat Italian 2 nights in a row.
Oh, and that was very upsetting. Two
They were
nights in a
very
row.
upset about that.
They almost filed for emancipation after 2 nights of Italian in a row. But I digress, babe. Go ahead.
I'm wondering, when we do the Women Who Rock, I always want to ask, what effect, if any, do you think that being a woman has on your career?
That's really interesting. It's hard to know, not
Right.
having been a man as well. So I can't think of it having really any impact on my career, at least that I was aware of. I think I always kind of told myself growing up that things were under my control. Although certainly doing some of the harassment and discrimination investigations I've done, that illusion was quickly shattered. We certainly know that that is not always the case, but I think I have been very lucky in my life for whatever reason, in terms of maybe it's being in the healthcare industry or being in private practice. I've been kind of buffered from any negative repercussions of that. And then I would have to say, when I worked in a maximum security prison, I felt like, if anything, it was really a benefit, because a lot of the inmates, or I guess incarcerated people that I was interviewing, I felt like a lot of the guys, I'll say mainly, I certainly evaluated plenty of women as well, but they seemed, I think, more comfortable in a way talking to me about certain
Mhm.
things and those kinds. So I think, if anything, it's been an advantage overall.
Very cool.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I wanted to talk a little bit about your other kind of, I don't know if career or just being an author, and what got you into that, I just, those books are all seem like, those are cool books and stuff that people can learn from. But particularly, I want to talk about, the one, 101 questions that true crime fans ask. So first of all, talk about becoming an author, and then are people just coming up to you all the time and asking you about serial killers? Is that why that's why that book came about?
Well, it almost, but not quite. So in 2007, I think it was 2007, it was either 2007 or 2010, I started writing a blog for Psychology Today, the magazine. And so I wrote a lot about law and crime. That's what my blog is focused on. And so I was lucky enough, as most blog writers have, to have kind of a following over time. And so I was getting a lot of questions about serial killers because that seems to be something that I'm not the only person who isn't kind of puzzled by and just horrified and all the things we talked about earlier. When you see those kind of murders and they just are kind of mind boggling. And so I kind of kept track of some of the questions. I knew a lot of the answers, I thought, but of course, not all of them. And so when the pandemic hit, I wrote all of them down. I just started writing all of them down and just adding the ones that I'd already been talking about, and so that's kind of how it got started. So it ended up, I probably could have kept going because there are so many questions and those kinds of things. That's kind of how the 101 questions where they came from.
And is that you still update the? I just put in the link for your Substack. So you're still updating that and giving folks information regularly on the site.
Well, I wrote a book about it based on the 101 questions, but I've been encouraged recently to kind of do another edition, another version, and I think I will at some point because initially I thought, what more could I possibly ask? I mean, 100 questions is a lot, and it was, but whether it's talking about specific cases, one of the things that I didn't really cover too much in the first book is international serial killers, how culture influences how different criminals operate, which is kind of an area of interest. So I think at some point I probably will update it or at least do another version of it because it is an interest of mine. And I think we are always trying to figure out what's the recipe for serial offenders and how can we spot them sooner and again ultimately prevent you know the progression, which is what you often see in serial killers.
Right. Go ahead, babe.
Um, well, I'm doing a little shift here from serial killers. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we're doing quite a few things on our channel to try and raise awareness. And I always want to ask my guests in November or October, good grief, I'm trying to make it November already. Um, do you, with domestic violence, could you speak to that a little bit as far as do you see any? I know you've worked so much on finding patterns and things with serial killers. Do you see any patterns with offenders who have a past of domestic violence that we should be aware of?
Well, there's so many different possible directions to go in with that question. I'll try to do a couple of different ones. One is um, I think we're all recognizing, at least in my field and a lot of other fields, just how domestic violence bleeds over into so many other criminal areas and how it really does affect all of us. We think about that in terms of, oh, the families of the alleged victims or the domestic violence victims. But we know, for example, that, 2/3 of mass shooters, mass murderers have a history of either domestic violence or they actually kill family members as part of that mass event. And so I think, in some respects, that has been a boost, if you will. I think for people becoming more aware, it can't just be seen as a woman's issue, right? It affects all of us. It's going to affect all of us. And so that has been something I think that we've all become a lot more aware of and talking about the fact that it is not, one gender's issue. It is not, it will affect all of us in one way or the other. And so I think that's something that's really become just so much more prevalent and understood and how important it is. And then I think the other thing that really kind of I think about is just, just how, just how difficult and it is when we talk about domestic violence and how complicated it is, and how important it is to really understand and not to make, to really understand all the different complexities and how important they are and how the solution can be so individual. I think that is one of the things that is so important, because it's so easy to kind of go, you get a restraining order all the time, or you do this, you do that. And it's like, no, it really is a very individualized kind of approach that's needed. So there's, and I think the last thing I'll mention about that is that I think there is a huge need still for an emphasis on domestic violence perpetrators and finding better ways to treat, to deal with those. I mean, and not just that, but to really boost accountability. I was reading, I think it was this past week, that about half of all, domestic violence perpetrators in California who are court ordered into treatment don't finish the program. About half of them, and there are never any consequences for it. There's never, it's like there's just some vacuum that it kind of goes into. So it's accountability. We need to have all these things in place, but we've got to enforce them. We've got to make sure that they're being followed, or nothing is really going to change.
That's so interesting. Since we started watching, court dockets with Judge, and you could just tell sometimes on some of them, these things are falling through the cracks, and that's why we had Judge Boyd on recently, who was a woman who rocked, and she makes it very clear. She asks about the family. She asks about who's watching the kid. Like, she asks all these follow up questions, and it seems pretty clear from what you're saying. If judges are not really paying attention, like Judge Boyd does, and not following up with this stuff, falls through the crack, and then it's like they just kick it down the line. They kick it to the next one. They kick it to the next one. The next appearance, and then nothing happens, and that appears to be like a major problem. Why it does the circle doesn't stop, like it just keeps going, right? I mean, that seems to be a major issue. Babe, go ahead. Do you have a question, or
No, that was my question, but
I can ask Debbie's question. You want me to ask Debbie's
okay,
question?
yeah.
Yes, we have a patron member question from Debbie. Thank you, Debbie. This is a great question. It says, I read Dr. Johnston's article about how false memory can play into wrongful convictions. I'd love to hear more about that, and if she feels that may be attributed to any recent cases, possibly the Delphi case, even though there isn't a conviction yet. Thank you. And thank you, Debbie S., for that question. That's a great question.
That really is a great question, and it's so complicated on the one hand. So we talk about false confessions. Let's kind of talk about those goes first of all. People falsely confess for a lot of different reasons. We often think about the person who's been interrogated for 24 hours straight and they haven't had any water and they're starving and they're being lied to and all those. And that is one situation that can happen when you get a false confession. Or you have a very vulnerable person who's being interviewed. They have some intellectual disability. They're very young, and so they get scared. They think they're going to be able to go home if they just say I did it. So, I mean, which of course, as adults, we kind of go, how could anybody think that? But if you're young and you're vulnerable and you're scared, it can be easy to kind of think short term. If I just say what they want to hear. People also confess falsely to protect somebody else, which is something we don't often think of. So I'm going to confess because I don't want my son to get in trouble, or I don't want my daughter to get in trouble. The issue of false memories, I think, is a little bit trickier because false memories oftentimes happen when there's a lot of suggestion, oftentimes, and you can relate to this, oftentimes by a therapist. Unfortunately, we have somebody who's, been in therapy. It's a very, very intense process, and the therapist may be out of, ill intention or just out of not knowing, kind of keeps you act just like somebody who's been sexually abused. Are you sure you haven't been sexually abused? Because you just have all the earmarks, the hallmarks of that. And maybe you just don't remember. And over time, and maybe that person starts thinking, gosh, my therapist really wants me to have been sexually abused for some reason. And so over time, that person kind of convinces themselves and starts believing on some level that they actually have been. So they're kind of different when you talk about these kind of false memories. When you look at false confessions, which I'm thinking of that your Patreon member might be talking about the Delphi case, even though there has not been any resolution to that. One of the puzzling things about that is when you talk about false confessions, oftentimes, again, the person is confessing to law enforcement. That's the kind of the classic thing. It's a little bit more difficult, I think, for me to understand. Again, I have not seen any confession. I have no idea what the context or the circumstances were, but it's hard for me to see how a false confession would fit into confessing to your mom, for example, or confessing to your wife. And this is what the prosecution is alleging happened here, that this person wasn't confessing to law enforcement, or this isn't a snitch who's behind bars, who's trying to get a better deal, who's saying, I heard this person say I did it. These are situations that certainly happen, and we can understand them. But it is more difficult, I think, without knowing more information, to explain why a person would be confessing to a wife or to a spouse.
That makes sense.
Absolutely. Um, so what is, we have another question from our chat that's along that same line. And he is Keystone Pirate. He's one of our members, and he's also a veteran. And he was wondering if you'd ever done any work with veterans with false memories.
That's such an interesting question. I mean, what comes to mind, which is completely different, is the stolen valor, which is very, very different from what you're talking about. And I've certainly evaluated, not a lot, but I've evaluated defendants who were lying about their combat service, or maybe I should say embellishing might be a better word. But I have not, to my knowledge, ever come across somebody who had false memories, because I think when you look at trauma, and Jenny, you can certainly speak to this, you often have these kind of flashbulb memories where things get almost solidified in their mind. People talk about, when you talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, people talk about, I can't get rid of these memories. I can't, they're intruding on me every day. I keep seeing this scene. I keep hearing this noise. I keep smelling the smoke. I want to forget. I don't want to have that. So, I wish I could think of a situation where somebody had a genuinely what I believed was a false memory.
Right.
I definitely can say, and this is not as related, but I think it does relate in terms of the false memory. I definitely had a couple of cases back in the 1980s, which was kind of the heyday of satanic ritual abuse, and there being a lot of concern about that. I had a couple of clients that were absolutely adamant, and they were actually related to each other, were absolutely adamant that there were these ritual sacrifices that were occurring, and just had all kinds of beliefs and memories and visions, and yet there was just no evidence whatsoever that this was occurring. And some of the things, it was hard to explain how it could happen without there being some physical evidence. And there was never any resolution to that. There was never anything that was found. There was never any, again, any prosecutions, any arrest or anything like that. But I absolutely will tell you that this client completely believed that this had happened to her. So that's the closest that I've come. And who am I to say? Again, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just saying there was never any evidence to support what she was saying. And some of the allegations were just so extreme. It is hard to believe, like I said, that there wouldn't be some evidence that you could find.
So I'm curious, regarding going back to the book Serial Killers, 101 Questions True Crimes Fans Ask, which, by the way, is on Amazon. Make sure you're checking it out. It's also on, all the links are on Dr. Johnston's website, so please check it out. I'm curious, is there like a top one or two or three where when something like Rex Heuermann comes out, or new cases come out that are like at the top that folks ask you about serial killers?
Yeah, there are a few of them, depending upon the situation, for sure. There's a lot of myths also that I think people carry around with them for understandable reasons. One, of course, is always, are serial killers born or made? I think people oftentimes want to know, is this person just born a serial killer, or at least born some kind of a predator and then, it shapes in a certain way? Or does this person have such a horrendous background that you think, it'd be almost impossible for this person not to carry all this anger and rage and those kinds of things? And I think it would be so great if we had an answer to that question. But I think, the challenge is we can certainly see patterns. We're learning more and more, for example, that when you have a sexually motivated serial killer, you often have this progression, from fantasies to then planning to then action. I mean, we're learning a lot more about sort of the evolution and those kinds of things. But we also are finding that there seems to be almost a perfect storm that has to happen for somebody to become a serial, perpetrator. And that recipe or that perfect storm can vary, depending upon the person. So, for example, we know that there are certainly more traumatic childhoods in the population of serial killers than there are the general population. And yet we all know that there are plenty of people who have had horrendous childhoods who not only didn't become a serial killer, they didn't become violent. And in fact, they became advocates for other people who had been traumatized. And so it's just a reminder, it's not just what happens to you, it's what protective factors you had in your life. It's the coping skills that you have, what you bring to the table in terms of your ability to cope. It's how you interpret what happened to you. It's so many things that makes it so complicated. And that's what I think makes it interesting, is to me, certainly as a psychologist, but it also is very frustrating. Because again, for every person who had a horrible childhood, you can find somebody who's doing really, really good. And you find people who didn't have a terrible childhood, who end up just being, so damaging of other people, and so violent and so angry. And so, whenever we talk about it, you can always kind of go, what about this person? This person didn't have a bad childhood. You're like, you're right. You're absolutely right. I do think there probably is some genetic predisposition, whether it's toward, and not a predisposition towards serial killing per se, but a predisposition, for example, perhaps for psychopathy, or a lack of feeling, or some things like that, that probably, set a person up for a vulnerability to adverse childhood events.
So I'm curious, just because you were talking about we're starting to learn more and more about these types of things. I'm curious, with social media now and just with technology in general, does it make it a little? I don't know if easier is the word, but like as far as you could see now with kids who are grown up now who commit crimes or murders, you almost have their entire childhood on film, or a lot more than in the past. Or for like on a case with like Rex Sherman, you have their internet searches and you have all the things they were looking at online, and that's all. Does that help in you learning more, that you have all this on your fingertips? Like actually, like before maybe in prior years you'd have to go by just by someone speaking to you and learning, but like now that you have all this data, and does that help you in assessing these cases?
It certainly helps in terms of catching some of the offenders, and it certainly can help in terms of some of the writings, for example, some of the online posts, some of the networks people have been involved in. I mean, there's lots of things that can help from a understanding point of view, for sure, as well. And then again, I mean, the things that come to mind immediately from a crime solving point of view is this forensic investigative genealogy, which has become a complete game changer. I mean, imagine that we can now, you know, get somebody's DNA and we can put it in a database, and we don't have to have a match like we had to have for years. We can, track that person's family and then work our way back down and identify somebody just based on that DNA. So there's no question that, all the cameras, all the social media, I mean, it's very difficult to be private these days. Now, the flip side of it is that there's lots of more ways to be predators in terms of, again, there's social media, there's online, there's catfishing, there's all kinds of things. And so I always remind myself that, technology is pretty neutral. It doesn't really have an agenda. It's the way that it's used that really, tells the story of what that person is doing and what they're wanting to do, and those kinds of things. And so, it's a blessing and a curse. I mean, it is hard to imagine growing up with, with my kids growing up and with your kids, talking about just what the impact is going to be of having their life in a fishbowl to some extent, where everything is out there, and not only that their life is out there, but their friends' lives are out there, and they're seeing when they didn't get invited to a party. Right. I mean, I might not know I didn't get invited to a party. Well, my kids always knew if they didn't get invited to a party because there's 500 pictures of everybody at the party, so, or somebody has a better dress, or I mean, just the whole thing. It's interesting. So I tend to be somewhat of an optimist in terms of thinking, okay, people are pretty resilient when it comes down to it. I think there's always bumps in the road when you have a new technology. We have to figure out how to manage it, how to use it effectively, not let it consume us. But I was reminded of this. So I went to a antique store. I love collecting, not memorabilia from killers, but I like collecting odd things. And I found this amazing poster of these people in the 1940s in LA, and they were all smashing these pinball machines. And it was this great poster because the guy was preaching a sermon about how pinball machines were the devil and were going to ruin all of the youth of the 1940s. And they were outlawed for 30 years.
Wow.
Pinball machines. Yes.
The devil. Pinball machines.
I mean, I guess maybe it was the devil's work. I guess I shouldn't say that
Right.
pinball machines were the actual devil, but they
Right,
were
right.
certainly a tool of the devil. So, whenever I kind of go down the path, which I do as a mom, of worrying, and I just kind of have to say, okay, again, as parents, we have to educate our children. We have to be aware of what they're doing. We have to, do the best that we can. And we also have to remind ourselves that unfortunately, the majority of crimes, certainly against children and against women, happen within the family, right? And so, not that we don't want to, make our kids aware that there are people out there that are looking for, some very bad things and trying to trick kids into sending pictures and doing all kinds of things. But we have to keep in perspective and make sure they're educated, but maybe not freak out too much.
Right.
So you are a mother, you're an author, you are on TV appearances quite frequently, you are doing blogging and all sorts of things for your Substack. I just have to ask you, what's your time management hack for all of this? How are you getting all this stuff done?
Well, I wish I could just reveal some elaborately organized system, but that would be a lie if I did. So I don't want to do that. I really feel like I'm so lucky. And I really, really do on so many different levels. But from a career standpoint, just for a minute, I love to learn, and I'm often writing about things I'm trying to learn and understand myself, and I'm trying to apply in my forensic work. And so I just try to keep an umbrella in mind. And sometimes things slide. As I've gotten a little bit older, I just remind myself that I can't do everything at once. And so sometimes I just kind of remind myself what is most important to me, what needs to be done, who am I best going to serve at this point in time. And so, that's what I try to do. And sometimes it works. Sometimes I'm staying up too late and ignoring my husband and he complains. And um, so, for the most part, it works. I'll put it that way.
So I'm curious, out of all the things that you do you have a favorite thing that you like doing the most? And then, like, what's your favorite thing that you like to do out of all the things that you do?
Wow. There are two things that come to mind, and this is the kind of the challenge. So I love doing the evaluations that I'm doing. I have this kind of odd model, I think, in my head that, well, when I first began my career, I worked exclusively with the victims, and I saw a ton of children and families who had been sexually abused, physically abused, neglected, and that was kind of the scope of my work, and it was just heart-wrenching and also incredibly fulfilling at the same time. And so at some point I decided, I need to understand every side if I'm going to be a good forensic psychologist, or the best forensic psychologist I can be. I want to understand what it's like to be a victim of a crime, what it's like to be a family member of a victim of a crime, what it's like to be a perpetrator of a crime, what it's like to be a family member of a perpetrator of a crime. And so I began working. I went and worked in a prison for a couple of years on staff there, and then do a lot of evaluations. And I feel so lucky in that I've been able to see both perspectives. And so in my day to day life, what I try to do is when I feel like so I do everything from mitigation evaluations for juvenile offenders, all the way to crime victim advocacy. And so I have this constant need to balance the scales out in my head and making sure that I'm paying equal attention, not always at the same time. So I love interviewing people who have lived experience, and this is often in a forensic way. I love that, and I'm trying to understand without judgment, because I think that is one of the gifts of being a forensic psychologist. Is I'm not in a position I can absolutely judge and do behaviors and the pain that it causes 100%, and do. But in terms of that person, my job is to understand where everybody is kind of coming from. And that is a gift I think that my profession gives me. It's a challenge at times. So I love that. I love that. And then my other real love is talking to just people who are interested in forensic psychology and true crime and trying to educate. When I started doing my YouTube channel, which kind of comes and goes in terms of how often I do it, I promised myself that I was going to use a true crime case as the start of the story. So I was a true crime, I hate to say fan, but I was interested in true crime before I became a forensic psychologist. I'm still interested in true crime. I listen to Dateline, 20, all those shows. I'm interested in those. But I feel like as a forensic psychologist, I want to strive to use that as a launching pad, to talk about whatever it is, whether it's mental illness and violence, and what is the relationship, and what are the myths about that, and what are not the myths about that. And you're talking about, a domestic violence situation, who's likely to kill a spouse and who's not, and how do we sort this out? And so that's my goal, and I absolutely love doing that. I love it.
Sounds like you really enjoy a lot of your career, which makes life way easier, I'm sure. But there's also where you're being the container for a lot of really terrible things when you are interviewing and when you're sitting with these people who are pouring that stuff out to you. What do you do for self-care?
I can probably ask you that question. And I'm just saying that, Shannon, because when I was in private practice, which I was, but it's been many years, it was much harder. It was much harder because I was seeing somebody, the same person every week, and going down that journey with that person. And that
Mm-hmm.
was absolutely heart wrenching for me. It really was just heart wrenching. And I still get affected by stories and evaluating individuals, but it's not as raw, I think, because I'm typically with that person for a relatively limited amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
So it allows me to be a little more distant. I mean, I'll tell you just flat out. When I first was in private practice, I was in my 20s, and or not my private practice, but I went through school relatively quickly, and worked for a nonprofit agency for a couple of years. And this is where I did all of my court work and working with child welfare or whatever. And they were a kind of a core group of us, um, you know, 5 or 6 of us. We were all in our 20s and maybe early 30s. And we did all this work all the time. And looking back, and we were so unaware, but every month or two, we would all go out and just get drunk. Just like, I mean, that's not unusual if you're in your 20s, but looking back, and I realized it was a trauma response in some respects, because I can remember, a couple of times when parental rights were terminated. I mean, it's one thing to see kids who have been neglected horribly or whatever, and then I would go sometimes because I would often have to testify in termination of parental rights hearings, and they were justified. And then you'd go see somebody and you'd look at the mom, and she looked like she was like 12 years old, you know, and you would just see this intergenerational kind of thing. And it was like, I mean, it just felt so horrible all the way around, even though it was the right thing. It's like, I didn't feel like fist pumping somebody when I went out. I just felt like this has got to stop. You know, we've got to find a way to intervene so that these things don't just happen and keep happening generation after generation. So it was very difficult at the time, I have to say. And I can remember many times getting in my car after seeing a child. I mean, I remember seeing a child one time who was 4, and he was just acting out an intimate moment that he should never have had any idea with these. And I remember getting in my car and just sobbing, you know, just absolutely sobbing. So that was difficult for me. Um,
Wow, I can imagine that's got to be really tough. All right, so I want to go get a little bit lighter from that. I want to talk about. You just talked about you go to you go to antique places and you get kind of like some oddities and you look for that type of stuff. With the poster about the pin. Do you have do you have any favorite pieces that you have found? Like what's the type of things that you're looking for when you go out and are shopping?
oh my gosh. I mean, I am the queen. I used to, when my kids were younger, now they're old enough where they can say no, they won't go. But I have to bribe them now. But, or guilt them. Guilt can also be effective if they've gotten older. But when they were little, I would just drag them. We'd be driving. I grew up in Alabama, and so I take them to Alabama every year. We'd drive in the country, and I just, oh my God, look at this place, and swerve, and we'd all go in and look for all this junk, and it was just such a big thing. So, but as I've gotten older, I am more specific in terms of what I'm looking for. So I like a lot of things, I guess, that remind me of my um, career in some respects. I've got a picture of Johnny Cash playing at the Folsom Prison that I thought was pretty interesting.
Nice.
I've got one of a prison baseball game that I thought was kind of interesting. If there is a prison museum in 500 miles, my husband's going to see it if we're on vacation, or a crime museum or whatever. I have Alfred Hitchcock is in the background, so I'm a
Yes,
big
I see
fan of
him.
Alfred Hitchcock. So I like those kinds of things. So yeah, I guess I've always liked kind of darker things in some ways, just things that have a little bit of an edge to them that don't creep over into, I mean, I understand people certainly have free choice, but I'm not going to be collecting things that people write that have been incarcerated or those kinds of things. That's just my
Right.
own personal thing. But I do understand it, and I do enjoy, like I said, finding quirky things of the pinball, smashing or those kinds of things. I really enjoy.
Well, that kind of resonated with us because Shannon and I are thrifters. Actually, before I started this true crime thing, we were going to do that full time. But I do more like 80s toys and stuff like that. But we also have to bribe our kids, although they're getting older now. So when they were younger and we would get them toys, they were excited about that. But now, not so much. But so that kind of resonated with me and Shannon, at least us, because we would make those stops too. If we're driving and we see like a cool little thrift store, we're like, we got to stop in there and check it out.
The chat is wondering if you are a war eagle or a roll tide.
I
Oh.
am. I went to Auburn. My parents went to Auburn. My grandparents went to Auburn. So War Eagle is all I have to say.
All the way. You
All
heard
the
it
way.
here first.
You got a problem? Then get out of here. Go ahead, babe. Do you have any other?
No, that was that was the question. The chat is on fire about it.
I love that. Yeah. Somebody's even, because it's so funny whenever I go somewhere and people are trying to be nice, right? Because they don't know Alabama very well or whatever. They go, roll tide immediately. They think I'm covered, right? And I just kind of go, I don't say anything, but I'm thinking, no, not roll tide. Although now that I'm in San Diego, I have to say, I really pull for Alabama when they're not playing Auburn. I've definitely come over. When you're living there, it's harder because there's a constant reminder of the rivalry and all that. But as I've gotten further away, I've come to appreciate my SEC roots and root for them.
Very cool. Well, I have one more question. I asked Shannon if this was okay to ask. So I hope it's. Don't, babe. Don't let. I mean, this is me as just thinking. So you have all this background, and you're you're constantly kind of breaking down behaviors and stuff like that. So I am curious if you're ever like at like a supermarket or getting your oil changed or somewhere, and like people are just acting out of control, and you're just like, all right, this guy probably killed someone. Or like, do you ever like, are you ever like out in public and you're just like, people are acting like a fool, and you're like, all right, this person has some skeletons in their closet. I'm curious if that you could turn it off, or you're always kind of thinking about that, when you're out in public.
I don't know. I personally am really never tempted to like analyze somebody when I'm out doing things. I avoid that at all cost because it's nice to kind of take that off. At the same time, I think most people who are therapists or have that background feel a lot of things. So I will say that there have been times when I've been standing next to somebody in a store and I feel sadness or I feel something that I sense that person is feeling a certain way. Now, I do not then say, "Are you depressed?" Or I'm getting this sense that you're not feeling good. So I think that that part of it for me is harder to turn off. And again, I'm not saying that I'm psychic by any means, but I will definitely say that I think being sensitive to other people's feelings is an important part of being a therapist. And I think it attracted me to being a therapist because I like that. And I had couple of family members who are very much empathic and that taught that as a value. So that is harder to turn off to feel those feelings. But in terms of stepping back and analyzing somebody, not too much. I mean, unless it's an obvious sign that somebody is having a psychotic episode, but then everybody would notice that, right?
Right.
Because of the way that person is acting.
Well, you're probably the person that when someone's like maybe having a little bit of a, whether it's they don't have, they have a little breakdown, you're the one who's like probably stepping back, like, where I'm like, all right, let's go. Let's next person in the line. If you're online, that's so interesting though, that you're like, you can kind of feel like their feelings. That's pretty extraordinary. I think that's pretty cool. Um,
And then I have to end with this question because this is my experience. When you sit down on a plane and you are going to be trapped there for the next foreseeable future, and people ask you what you do for a living, do you want to lie so that they do not know that you are a mental health professional and then they dump all their problems on you? Or they're like, oh, well, my niece is really going through whatever. I never want to tell anyone what I do on a plane.
I cannot tell you that I've never told a lie about that on a plane. I mean, I'm ashamed to say that, but I cannot tell a lie to you because it's true. But I think and I felt terrible, but I did have that experience enough times that,
Yes.
and the thing is, I mean, I am a grown up. I can certainly say, I really plan to read this book but who's going to do, I can't, that's the problem. Like I'm protecting me from myself in a way, because if the person starts telling me some things that are going on, I don't want to not listen. This
Right.
person is needing something. And so it's like, I realized, okay, either I'm going to do that on a regular basis, which sometimes I do. But the other part of it is, okay, what if you're not up for it? Then you need to figure out how to do it before they start telling you stuff, because then you're not going to do it. And you shouldn't do it because you've kind of opened that door in a weird kind of a way. So
Right.
once I started doing other things, like writing a book or blogging, or I will say sometimes I'm a blogger or I'm a writer or I'm so I would just pick another, another hat that I wear and throw that one
Mhm.
out there.
Wonderful.
I have to say, and I think you're friends with Mac, and I think you're talking to you and listening to your YouTube and your channels and stuff. Like, I feel like it's very similar in that when you talk, it kind of calms people down. I don't know. It's kind of it just when you hear you could tell you're empathetic, and you could you're thoughtful and kind. And I think I don't know if the folks in the chat, I'm sure they feel the same way that I do. That like it's kind of just a nice. Just you take a breath because it feels good, because you're a kind person, and we can't thank you enough for coming on here. I did want to say this. I don't know if you follow the Murdaugh trial at all, the Alex Murdaugh trial.
I definitely have followed
So
that trial.
we learned. I'm from New York, so I were you familiar with the term bow before? Is that in Alabama the term bow?
The term,
Bow, B-O, bow.
Like, hey, Bo.
Like, hey, Bo, like, how are you
uh-uh,
doing? All right, so
no.
so we learned during that trial in South Carolina, Bo is kind of like buddy or friend. Hey, Bo, how you doing? So we kind of we took that, and we're all friends here. We call our Bows, and like I'm Jay, so we call it J Bo Nation, and just a bunch of friends. And now you are part of J Bo Nation, which means you're gonna have all these folks in the chat, and everyone who watched this, they're gonna be on your YouTube liking you and giving good comments. They're gonna be following your Twitter. So I want to welcome you to J Bo Nation, and just thank you so much, really, for coming on. It really means the world. And make sure you're following the YouTube, buying the books, signing up for the newsletter. Any final words, Dr. Johnston?
It was such a pleasure. It really was a pleasure. It was so fun. I loved the questions. It was so fun to get questions that were not exactly the normal questions in terms of just my career. And so I really had a great time, and I appreciate the opportunity. And I love being part of the Bo Nation.
J Bo Nation, you're a part of it now. I'm telling you, these are some of the kindest people you're going to find on the internet. We have just a bunch of nice folks, and they like to support all our guests who are kind enough to come on the show with us. So you'll see on your YouTube videos, you'll see little comments, you'll see on your Twitter or Facebook. Do you have a Facebook too? You have a Facebook page too, right?
I do. I do.
So check that out. We'll put all that in the links and the bio and everything. We'll check that out. So I think that's it. So goodbye, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us, J-Bo Nation. Please give all of yourselves an ovation. No, it won't be real long until next time. Oh, J-Bo Nation, there's no place we'd rather be. J-Bo Nation is the place to 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 be.